April 8, 1943, nearly 27,000 feet over the French town of Caen. Through the thin sheen of frost on the canopy of his Focke-Wulf 190A5, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermaschen couldn't hide the grin stretching beneath his oxygen mask. The seasoned ace of Jagdgeschwader 26 watched with amusement as a peculiar formation of American fighters crawled upward toward him, their silhouettes clumsy and misshapen against the pristine sky. "These Americans have sent us their flying milk cans," he joked over the radio, unable to contain his laughter. Far below, 16 P-47C Thunderbolts from the 4th Fighter Group strained for altitude, their massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines roaring in protest as they tried to lift nearly 7 tons of airplane into the thinning air. To Luftwaffe pilots accustomed to the sleek lines of Spitfires or the nimble Soviet Yaks, these bulky American machines looked almost comedic. Thick, barrel-like fuselages, topped with greenhouse cockpits, wings that seemed too stubby for their enormous bodies, and propellers so large they dwarfed anything in German service. The Thunderbolt appeared more like an overweight brute than a fighter. But what Hermaschen and the other German pilots circling like vultures above them could not possibly imagine was that they were witnessing the appearance of a machine that would, within 18 months, dismantle the Luftwaffe's fighter arm piece by piece. These flying milk bottles the Germans mocked would soon become symbols of terror. The 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns mounted in each wing would evolve into the most dreaded sound German pilots could hear. Inside those wide wings already lay the mathematics of destruction. 3,400 rounds of ammunition, a combined rate of fire approaching 6,000 rounds per minute, and enough concentrated firepower to saw a Messerschmitt in half in under 2 seconds. The shift in perception began that very morning, when Major Donald Blakesley, commander of the 335th Fighter Squadron, spotted the German formation setting up an attack run. Blakesley, a former Eagle Squadron pilot who had only recently transitioned from RF Spitfires, understood something his men had not yet learned. Flying the P-47 required abandoning everything they thought they knew about air combat. The Thunderbolt represented a break from traditional fighter design. While Germany had embraced lightweight interceptors optimized for rapid climbing and tight turning, Republic Aviation had produced something entirely different. A high-altitude sledgehammer built around power, mass, and sheer firepower. Among the 56 American pilots scattered across the French sky that day were men who would one day become legends. But on April 8, 1943, they were novices in an unproven aircraft, facing the most battle-hardened fighter force on Earth. The Germans had been at war since 1939. The Americans had been in combat for exactly 0 days. The opening chapter of this clash was not merely about pilots or machines. It was the beginning of a contest between 2 vastly different philosophies of war. One relied on seasoned aces, honed through years of continuous fighting across multiple fronts. The other depended on industrial might, engineering audacity, and young aviators barely initiated into combat. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt itself had been born out of crisis. In June 1940, as German forces swept across France and Luftwaffe fighters dominated European skies, the U.S. Army Air Corps delivered an urgent request to Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian-born chief designer at Republic Aviation. They demanded a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching or surpassing whatever the Luftwaffe could deploy. Kartveli's answer was not what they expected. It will be a monster, he warned his team, but a monster with proper proportions. And so it was. When the XP-47B prototype flew on May 6, 1941, it stunned everyone who saw it. Weighing nearly 10,000 pounds empty, 65% heavier than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer, it dwarfed every fighter the United States had ever built. The enormous turbo supercharger system, with its complex network of ducts running through the rear fuselage, gave the aircraft an almost swollen, ungainly profile. Test pilots arriving for their first inspection often asked the same incredulous question: does this thing actually fly? It did, and at altitude it flew like nothing else in the world. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial brute delivering 2,000 horsepower, could maintain full power at 27,000 feet, a height where German fighters were already starving for oxygen. Fed by exhaust-driven turbines, the turbo supercharger allowed the engine to breathe as if it were still at sea level, giving the P-47 unmatched performance in the upper reaches of the atmosphere. Yet, the path to operational readiness was brutal. Major Hubert Hub Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group during their training in Bridgeport, Connecticut, initially despised the aircraft. Between September 1942 and January 1943, his unit suffered catastrophic losses, 18 pilots killed and 41 aircraft destroyed in accidents. The Thunderbolt seemed more dangerous to Americans in training than Germans in combat. It ground-looped easily on landing, torque rolled violently during takeoff, and dove with such ferocity that pilots encountered compressibility, controls freezing as shock waves formed on the wings. But those who survived the learning curve discovered a revelation. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a young Oklahoman farm boy who would later become one of America's leading aces with 27 victories, described the sensation of his first flight. It felt like being strapped to a runaway locomotive. The power wasn't just impressive, it was overwhelming. You didn't fly the P-47, you aimed it. The early combats of April and May 1943 seemed to vindicate every German assumption. Thunderbolts could not turn with the Focke-Wulf 190, nor climb with the Messerschmitt 109, nor match their crisp handling at medium altitudes. Luftwaffe units quickly adapted, targeting the P-47's weaknesses, striking from below where the heavy fighters struggled, forcing turning engagements where agility mattered more than firepower. Hauptmann Josef Pips Priller, the commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 26, summed it up in a sardonic after-action report. The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It maneuvers like a truck, turns like a freight wagon, climbs like a cow heavy with calf. Our men call them Indians, big targets pretending to be warriors. Statistics initially seemed to support his arrogance. In their first month of operations, American P-47 units lost 14 Thunderbolts while only confirming 3 enemy kills. RAF pilots watching from the sidelines quietly suggested the Americans reconsider their choice of aircraft. One British flyer joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap and run around inside its cavernous cockpit. But beneath these early impressions, something significant was taking shape. Something German intelligence failed to recognize. Thunderbolts that were shot down had endured unbelievable punishment before falling. One returned on May 4th with 21 cannon hits and more than 100 machine gun strikes, damage that would have shredded a Spitfire or Messerschmitt into confetti. The rugged radial engine, lacking any vulnerable coolant lines, shrugged off hits that would have doomed liquid-cooled German fighters instantly. And when a P-47 did line up its guns, the effect was devastating. The convergence zone of its 850 calibers created a curtain of destruction unlike anything German pilots had faced before. Unlike cannon with limited ammunition or rifle-caliber guns of earlier years, P-47 pilots could hold the trigger for over 30 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat. The moment that truly began reshaping German opinions of the Thunderbolt came on June 26, 1943, over the French town of Lizeau. It involved a young pilot named Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron, and an encounter that would pass into legend on both sides of the war. Johnson's group of 48 P-47s was returning from escort duty when 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from 2/JG-26, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutz-Galland, younger brother of the famed Adolf Galland, executed a near-perfect bounce from the sun. With the advantage of height and speed, the German fighters dove through the American formation like knives through cloth. Johnson's Thunderbolt, flying in the vulnerable rear position, was hit almost immediately. Multiple 20mm shells slammed into his aircraft, ripping it apart in seconds. The canopy shattered. Hydraulic fluid splashed across the cockpit, the cowling was torn open, and flames licked at the instrument panel. Shrapnel sliced into Johnson's face and legs. Dazed and bleeding, he attempted to bail out, only to discover the canopy rails were fused shut by an exploding shell. He was trapped inside a burning airplane at 27,000 feet. Against every expectation, the mutilated Thunderbolt continued flying. With the windscreen coated in oil and barely any response from his controls, Johnson managed to level the aircraft and aim it toward the English coast. Any other fighter of the era would have fallen apart long before. The P-47 refused. But the ordeal was far from over. As Johnson limped toward the channel at barely 170 miles per hour, a lone FW-190 from JG-26 spotted the wounded Thunderbolt. Historians have never conclusively identified the German pilot, though several candidates exist. What followed has no equal in the annals of air combat. The FW-190 closed in behind Johnson and unleashed its entire weapon load, 4 20mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns, into the crippled P-47. Unable to maneuver, Johnson could only press himself behind the armor plating and pray. The Thunderbolt soaked up the cannon shells like a steel sponge. When the German pilot exhausted all his cannon ammunition, he repositioned and fired again with his machine guns. Still the P-47 flew. The German drew alongside, close enough for Johnson to see the pilot's youthful face change from confidence to confusion to bewildered shock. After emptying his remaining ammunition into the Thunderbolt, the FW-190 pulled up beside Johnson once more. This time, the German pilot simply shook his head. A wordless salute to a machine that should not have still been airborne, and then banked away, out of ammunition and out of answers. Johnson somehow coaxed the dying Thunderbolt to Manston Airfield, where it collapsed on landing. His crew chief stopped counting bullet holes after reaching 200. Cannon bursts had detonated inches from Johnson's head. The armor plate behind his seat bore the imprint of a direct hit. The engine had taken multiple strikes. Structural beams were nearly severed. And yet the P-47 brought its pilot home. The incident sent shockwaves through both air forces. American engineers studying the aircraft realized they had underestimated the monster they had built. German intelligence officers refused to believe the early reports, until corroborating statements from multiple pilots left no room for doubt. If a Thunderbolt could survive that, what else could it survive? By July 1943, American pilots were beginning to uncover the P-47's true potential. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, distilled the secret after countless losses and hard lessons. Don't turn with them, don't climb with them low. Use your weight, use your speed, use your guns. The Thunderbolt's greatest flaw, its enormous mass, suddenly became its greatest weapon. In a dive, nothing in the German arsenal could catch it. From 30,000 feet, a P-47 could hit 550 miles per hour, outrunning even the sleek W-190. That speed translated into an energy advantage that allowed Thunderbolts to climb away from danger and reposition at will. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin pioneered the tactic that would define P-47 combat, boom and zoom warfare. Climb high, attack from above with crushing speed, fire a devastating burst, then climb back to safety before the enemy could respond. German pilots who survived the Thunderbolt's diving passes described it as encountering a solid wall of lead, sudden, overwhelming, and impossible to evade. Aircraft caught in that convergence zone didn't merely go down. They detonated. The full measure of American firepower became unmistakably clear during the August 17, 1943 mission, the twin deep strike raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg. It was the most ambitious penetration into Germany attempted up to that point. The operation highlighted both the P-47's shortcomings, especially its limited range, and its horrifying destructive potential when used correctly. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron, encountered a formation of Messerschmitt Bf-110 destroyers, poised to unleash their heavy cannons and rockets on a stream of B-17s. Designed as bomber killers, the twin-engine Bf-110s packed enormous firepower but lacked the agility to protect themselves in a turning fight. Schilling and 3 other Thunderbolt pilots rolled into a near-vertical dive from 28,000 feet. What happened next left even the Germans stunned. Unteroffizier Hinrich Roth, a surviving gunner in one of the Bf-110s, later recounted during interrogation, "The Americans fell upon us like thunderbolts from the heavens. I opened fire at 800 meters. I saw the hits on the fighter's wing. It didn't even twitch. Then he fired. The aircraft in front of us simply ceased to exist. not shot down, destroyed. Within seconds, an entire Bf-110 disintegrated. Wings separated, the tail sheared off, the fuselage shredded into flying scraps. 8 German heavy fighters were wiped out in under a minute. Roth admitted the shock was indescribable. The Bf-110 crews had never witnessed such focused, instantaneous destruction. Every P-47 carried 425 rounds per gun, 3,400 total, nearly 900 pounds of ammunition. At normal convergence settings, around 300 yards, all 8 streams intersected in a kill zone roughly 6 feet across. Within that sphere, the Thunderbolt could unleash more than 100 projectiles per second. For German pilots, being caught in that stream meant instant annihilation. While German cannons were individually more powerful, they suffered from limited ammunition, often just a few seconds' worth of fire. By contrast, a P-47 pilot could hold the trigger for half a minute, allowing him to saturate the sky with lethal metal. Lieutenant Colonel Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, who would become America's highest-scoring ace in Europe with 28 victories, described the effect bluntly. When all 8 hit, it's not a kill, it's execution. I saw a 109 come apart like it was made of paper. By late summer 1943, another truth was becoming painfully obvious to the Luftwaffe. The higher the fight went, the worse their odds became. The P-47 thrived where German fighters struggled. The double Wasp engine maintained full rated power well above 30,000 feet, courtesy of its turbo supercharger. German engines, relying on mechanical superchargers, lost breath rapidly above 25,000 feet. This difference became fatal on October 8, 1943. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most revered aces with 206 victories, was leading Jagdgeschwader 1 during an interception of B-70s near Bremen. At 28,000 feet, his FW-190A6 was sluggish and gasping for air. When the 56th Fighter Group's Thunderbolts dove from 32,000 feet, the German formation was practically motionless. Robert S. Johnson, now a seasoned pilot, engaged Phillips' aircraft. His combat report was cold and brief. Opened fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection. Observed hits along the fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. No parachute. Phillips' death sent tremors through the Luftwaffe. One of their greatest talents, a veteran of more than 500 missions across every major front, had been obliterated in seconds. High Command demanded an immediate technical analysis of the P-47. The findings delivered to Goering in November 1943 were grim. Thunderbolt service ceiling over 42,000 feet, unreachable by German fighters. Dive speeds approaching the transonic realm. Heavy armor, 3-inch steel behind the pilot, half-inch armored glass windscreen. Extraordinary survivability, capable of returning home with damage that would obliterate other fighters. For the first time, German leadership admitted privately, the P-47 was not a clumsy monster. It was an unstoppable one. January 1944 marked the arrival of a Thunderbolt variant that would erase any lingering German belief that the aircraft was slow or unresponsive. The P-47D-22 introduced a massive Hamilton standard paddle blade propeller, 13 feet across, with wide, shovel-like blades that bit into the air far more effectively than earlier designs. The transformation was immediate. Thunderbolts that once clawed their way skyward now surged upward with conviction. Climb rates jumped from an unimpressive 2,200 feet per minute to almost 3,000 at sea level, putting the P-47 on equal footing with and often surpassing the BA-09 and FW-190 at most practical altitudes. Acceleration improved as well, allowing Thunderbolts to build energy quickly in straight-line flight. For German pilots, the change was jarring. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke of Jagdgeschwader 11, a veteran of more than 200 missions, encountered the new Thunderbolts in February 1944 during a bomber interception near Hanover. The shock in his diary entry is unmistakable. The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We attacked expecting our usual advantage. They turned into us and climbed with us. When we tried to break off, they followed to 30,000 feet. Schmidt was caught and blown apart. These are not the same machines we mocked last year. The paddle blade propeller didn't only enhance performance, it changed the Thunderbolt's voice. The broad blades produced a deep, rolling thunder as their tips neared supersonic speeds. German troops on the ground claimed they could identify a P-47 long before seeing it, describing the sound as a distant storm drawing closer. They gave it a name, Donnerschlag, the thunderclap. By March 1944, Thunderbolts equipped with drop tanks could escort bombers deep into the Reich. 2 108-gallon wing tanks or a 75-gallon belly tank gave them more than 1,000 miles of operational range. The new paddle blade propeller meant that even heavily loaded Thunderbolts could enter combat immediately after jettisoning their tanks, without suffering the sluggishness that plagued earlier models. The Luftwaffe's answer was simple but suicidal: ignore the escorts and attack the bombers directly. But doing so required diving through a protective wall of P-47s. Major Günther Rahl, one of Germany's greatest aces with 275 victories, learned this the hard way. On March 6, 1944, while attacking American bombers, his flight was ambushed by Thunderbolts diving from above. Rahl's aircraft was riddled with bullets, and he barely survived a crash landing that shattered his back. His later recollection was chilling. We saw their silhouettes above us, large and heavy against the sun. Someone joked, "Here come the flying pigs." No one laughed 30 seconds later. The sky erupted. Their first pass destroyed 3 of our fighters instantly. Their guns did not chatter like ours. They poured out fire in solid streams. To be caught in that stream meant immediate death. Even when German pilots escaped the first diving attack, the Thunderbolt's endurance kept it in the fight. The Luftwaffe struggled with chronic fuel shortages. German fighters often operated on the bare minimum necessary to reach combat and return. P-47s, in contrast, could loiter for hours, rotating high cover positions while still carrying enough fuel for prolonged engagements. As newer P-51 Mustangs arrived in spring 1944 to shoulder the deepest escort missions, P-47s increasingly shifted to a role that would make them legendary among soldiers on the ground, fighter bombers without equal. In April 1944, as Allied commanders prepared for the invasion of France, the Thunderbolt revealed the full extent of its versatility. Its 8 50-caliber guns, already terrifying in the air, proved equally devastating against targets on land. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds could rip through the thin top armor of most German vehicles, while a short burst could turn trucks, troops and artillery positions into burning wreckage. A mere 2-second burst from a P-47 delivered 160 half-inch projectiles into a target the size of a truck, a dose of destruction no ground unit could withstand. But the Thunderbolt was about to become something even more dangerous. The D-25 variant introduced a staggering payload capacity, 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings, a 500-pound bomb under the fuselage. It was now carrying the bomb load of early war medium bombers. Soon after came the HVAR rockets, 10 5-inch high-velocity projectiles, each equivalent in explosive force to a 105mm artillery shell. Oberst Hans von Luck, commander of the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment in Normandy, described surviving a P-47 attack. They came in so low you could see the pilots' faces. The noise was unimaginable, engines screaming, rockets shrieking, then the hammering of those heavy guns. A column of trucks simply vanished, 20 vehicles reduced to burning skeletons in a single pass. The effect on our men was catastrophic. These were not fighter bombers. They were flying artillery. Precise, merciless, unstoppable. June 6, 1944. D-Day. On this morning, the Luftwaffe finally understood just how far the balance of power had shifted. More than 500 P-47 Thunderbolts filled the sky above the invasion beaches, forming an aerial shield that no German pilot could penetrate. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of Jagdgeschwader 2 was one of only 3 German pilots who even reached the beachhead that day. His report captured the hopelessness of the situation. The sky belonged entirely to the Americans. Thunderbolts were stacked above each other from sea level to the stratosphere. We tried to break through at dawn, 12 of us. I was the only one to return. Wherever we went, there were P-47s waiting. You could not climb above them, could not dive below them. Their guns turned our aircraft into falling scraps of metal. In the days and weeks that followed D-Day, the Thunderbolt became the closest thing the Allies had to a weapon of annihilation. P-47s roamed the skies of France with near impunity, destroying anything that dared move in daylight. Their performance statistics for June alone bordered on the unbelievable. 651 locomotives destroyed 3,847 trucks, obliterated 512 tanks and armoured vehicles, knocked out 4,553 horse-drawn transports, eliminated D. The Wehrmacht quickly learned a grim rule: move only at night, or not at all. Attempts to adapt were futile. Armour was reinforced, convoys dispersed, camouflage improved, flak batteries multiplied. None of it worked. The Thunderbolt was too fast, too tough, too heavily armed. Even the dreaded 88mm flak guns, the best German air defence weapon of the war, had difficulty tracking a P-47 making a high-speed attack run. While P-47s pulverised Europe, another set of Thunderbolts, the 348th Fighter Group, was proving that the aircraft's strengths were equally unstoppable in the Pacific. Operating from rough airstrips in New Guinea, the group quickly discovered that the P-47's durability, range and firepower were tailor-made for the vast distances and brutal conditions of the Pacific theatre. Colonel Neil Kirby, commander of the 348th, adapted Thunderbolt tactics for the Pacific environment with lethal effectiveness. On October 11, 1943, Kirby led 4 P-47s against a formation of roughly 40 Japanese aircraft over Wewak. In the fight that followed, he personally shot down 6 enemy planes, a feat that earned him the Medal of Honor. Japanese pilots who were accustomed to fighting lighter, more fragile American fighters were stunned by the P-47's resilience. The rugged radial engine and thick armor made it extraordinarily hard to bring down. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who encountered P-47s over New Guinea, later wrote, "We called them monsters. Our 20mm cannon shells that tore apart P-40s did almost nothing. I hit one Thunderbolt dozens of times and watched it fly away. Their return fire was terrifying, thick streams of bullets that ripped aircraft to pieces." To meet the demands of long-range Pacific operations, the P-47N variant was introduced. With expanded wings housing 93 gallons of fuel each, the aircraft could fly more than 2,300 miles, enough to escort B-29s all the way to Japan and back. The once short-legged brute of 1943 had evolved into a long-range heavyweight capable of crossing oceans. Perhaps the Thunderbolt's most startling achievement came in its encounters with German jet fighters. The Me-262, with a top speed over 540 miles per hour, should have been untouchable for any piston-engine fighter. Yet P-47 pilots found 2 vulnerabilities. Jets were helpless during takeoff and landing, and vulnerable to high-speed dives from above. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group shot down an Me-262 after diving from 28,000 feet. As his Thunderbolt approached 500 miles per hour, he closed the distance on the jet until he was close enough to fire. His gun camera recorded the moment the 262 broke apart, shedding engines and wings like burning debris. Meyer's assessment was simple. The jet was fast, but it couldn't take a hit. One burst from our 850s and it disintegrated. By early 1945, specialized P-47M models were being deployed to counter jets and V-1 flying bombs. Equipped with water methanol injection, these machines produced nearly 2,800 horsepower, reaching speeds of 470 miles per hour at altitude. Fast enough to intercept targets previously thought safe from prop-driven aircraft. Major George Bostwick, flying a P-47M, shot down 2 Me-262s in March 1945. His tactical report emphasized one undeniable truth. The jets are faster, but they can't turn and they can't take punishment. One good hit from our guns and they come apart like paper. The full weight of American industrial supremacy became unmistakable during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate New Year's Day offensive on January 1, 1945. Nearly 900 German fighters, many flown by their remaining veterans, launched surprise, low-level attacks against Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. It was the Luftwaffe's final attempt to cripple Allied air power. At Airfield Y-34 near Metz, home of the 365th Fighter Group's P-47s, the attack initially seemed successful. German fighters roared in at treetop height, strafing parked Thunderbolts and setting aircraft ablaze. 22 P-47s were destroyed on the ground within minutes. A captured German pilot, taken to the command post as smoke still rose from the field, smugly gestured toward the burning wrecks and asked an American officer, "So, what do you think of that?" Major George Brooking's answer became one of the most famous lines of the 9th Air Force. "By tomorrow, we'll have 40 new airplanes. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The German pilot's confidence evaporated instantly. He understood the truth behind those words. The German fighters had inflicted damage, but they had also lost 271 aircraft and 213 irreplaceable pilots, including instructors and experienced leaders. The Luftwaffe never recovered. Within 48 hours, brand new P-47D-40 Thunderbolts arrived from depots in England, filling the flight line as if nothing had happened. The Americans lost 134 aircraft across all targeted airfields that day. Every single one replaced within a week. Numbers told the real story of the war. Republic Aviation built 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts, more than any other American fighter. At peak production, the Farmingdale, Long Island factory completed one P-47 every hour, around the clock. In Evansville, Indiana, a factory built on empty farmland, production reached 500 Thunderbolts per month by 1944. Each P-47 required 65,000 individual parts, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, 300 pounds of rubber, 8 miles of electrical wiring, 2,400 precision-machined engine components. Many of the workers assembling these machines were women who had never seen an airplane before the war, yet they produced fighters more reliable than anything Germany could manufacture under bombardment. The ammunition situation was just as staggering. A single P-47 sortie consumed up to 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. With hundreds of Thunderbolts flying each day, US consumption exceeded 10 million rounds per month by mid-1944. The Lake City Arsenal in Missouri alone produced 30 million rounds per month, each manufactured to microscopic tolerances. Fuel consumption was equally massive. A P-47 drank 100 gallons per hour in cruise and up to 300 gallons in combat using water injection. The 9th Air Force alone consumed more than 25 million gallons of aviation fuel per month in late 1944, fuel Germany simply did not have. Yet even more decisive than the machines was the human factor. By 1944, the United States was graduating 30,000 pilots per year, more than Germany trained in the entire war. Each American fighter pilot typically entered combat with at least 400 hours of flight training, 100 hours in advanced fighters, gunnery practice formation, drills instrument training, tactical instruction, gun camera analysis, time in simulators, and mock combat. German pilots entering combat in 1944 and 1945 often had less than 100 total flight hours, some as few as 60. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, who arrived in England in September 1944, described the contrast. "I had 420 hours in my logbook, including 75 in the P-47. We practiced gunnery until it was muscle memory, studied combat footage, flew in every weather condition. My first mission, I knew exactly what to do. The German pilot I fought that day didn't even have half my experience. It wasn't a fair fight." By contrast, the Luftwaffe's veteran corps had been depleted by years of attrition. Fuel shortages crippled training, spare parts vanished, new pilots were thrown into combat barely knowing how to handle their aircraft. It was a mathematical certainty. No matter how skilled the Germans were, they could not match the American machine. By early 1945, even the Luftwaffe itself no longer believed its own propaganda. At Oberursel, the German interrogation center for captured Allied pilots, intelligence officers maintained constantly updated assessments of enemy aircraft. The report on the P-47, revised repeatedly over the course of the war, tells the entire story of Germany's changing perception. April 1943, large, unmaneuverable fighter, inferior to German types in all categories except dive performance, machine gun armament inadequate against cannon-armed aircraft, threat level minimal. December 1943, unexpectedly strong performance at high altitude, structural durability significant, firepower increasingly problematic, pilot tactics improving, Threat level, serious above 25,000 feet. June 1944, dominant fighter bomber. Superior to German fighters above 20,000 feet. Devastating ground attack capability. Very difficult to shoot down due to extreme ruggedness. Threat level, critical at all altitudes. March 1945, possibly the best fighter bomber of the war. Unmatched combination of firepower, survivability and altitude performance. American pilot proficiency exceptional. Threat level, cannot be engaged safely. The Luftwaffe's transformation in attitude was perfectly captured by a man who, ironically, had mocked the Thunderbolt from the beginning. Josef Pips Priller, the same ace who once joked that P-47s climbed like pregnant cows. By 1945 he was exhausted, wounded, and watching the Luftwaffe disintegrate around him. When German propaganda officials asked him for an uplifting statement to boost morale, Priller's answer was deemed too demoralizing to publish. It remained buried until after the war. He said, "The Thunderbolt is the finest fighter bomber ever built. Its firepower is unmatched. Its guns do not jam. Its ammunition does not run out. It carries bombs like a medium bomber, rockets like artillery, and fights like a frontline fighter. What terrifies us is not just the machine, it is what it represents. Unlimited American production. They lose 10 aircraft and replace them with 20. We lose one, and it is gone forever. Their pilots arrive better trained than our instructors. They have fuel to burn, ammunition to practice with, spare parts for every system. We have courage, nothing more. And courage without resources is merely the delay of defeat. We laughed in 1943. We do not laugh now. When you hear the thunder of their guns, you know death has come. The sound haunts us even when the sky is empty." This growing terror wasn't limited to fighter pilots. German ground troops had their own term for the condition. Thunderbolts inspired Jabo fever, fighter bomber fever. Soldiers reported nausea, shaking hands, tunnel vision, and uncontrollable panic whenever someone shouted that Thunderbolts were approaching. Veterans who had fought the RAF for years without fear felt physical dread at the sound of P-47 engines. The deep roar of the paddle blade propeller became a psychological weapon as potent as any bomb or rocket. One young German pilot, Feldwebel Klaus Brechthinder, among the last to receive flight training in 1945, flew a single combat mission. It lasted 12 seconds. He recalled, "They fell on us from above, 4 Thunderbolts in perfect formation. I turned, but they were too fast. The first burst hit me from hundreds of meters away. My engine exploded. My wing tore off. I bailed out through fire. In my parachute, I watched them erase my entire staffel, 6 fighters gone in less than a minute. The sky filled with burning metal and falling bodies. That was my first mission, and my last." By the start of 1945, Luftwaffe fighters existed mostly on paper. Fuel reserves were almost non-existent. Airfields were cratered ruins. Veteran pilots were either dead or captured. New pilots were barely trained, and above it all, dominating every altitude from treetops to 40,000 feet, were the Thunderbolts. The final statistics of the Thunderbolts campaign hardly seem real. They read more like the results of a systematic extermination than the work of a single-engine fighter. Across Europe, P-47 units recorded 3,752 German aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, 3,315 destroyed on the ground, 86,000 railway cars wrecked, 9,000 locomotives eliminated, 6,000 armoured fighting vehicles destroyed, 68,000 trucks turned into scrap, 60,000 horse-drawn wagons wiped out. In the Pacific, the numbers were smaller only because the scale of the theatre was different. 697 Japanese aircraft shot down in aerial combat, 150 destroyed on the ground, 1,500 vehicles destroyed, 150 locomotives eliminated, countless barges, supply depots and ships obliterated. The 9th Air Force alone, mostly flying P-47s, conducted 203,873 combat sorties, dropped 120,000 tons of bombs, fired 135 million rounds, and launched 60,000 rockets by war's end. Their kill ratio stood at 4.6 to 1, while suffering the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter bomber. But behind these numbers lay a human cost that Germany could not hide. The Luftwaffe lost roughly 28,000 fighter pilots killed in combat against the Western Allies. Many died in bursts of 50 caliber fire, so intense that their aircraft disintegrated before they understood they were under attack. Each loss represented years of training that Germany could no longer afford. By 1945, the average new Luftwaffe pilot arrived at the front with under 30 hours of combat experience, some with barely 15 minutes of actual aerial gunnery practice. By contrast, American Thunderbolt pilots routinely entered battle with more than 200 hours of combat time and hundreds more in training. In the closing months of the war, a fascinating document surfaced at the Oberrursel interrogation center, a captured German intelligence file evaluating Allied aircraft. The P-47 section was updated throughout the war and showed the complete collapse of German confidence. But it was a comment at the very end of the file, written by a weary intelligence officer in early 1945, that said it all. Engagement with P-47 fighters is no longer survivable. They possess altitude superiority, firepower superiority, pilot superiority, and numerical superiority. Recommendation: avoid contact. In 1985, at a reunion in Phoenix, Arizona, former German and American fighter pilots met as old men instead of adversaries. Among them was General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, former head of the Luftwaffe Fighter Command, a man who had once dismissed the Thunderbolt as a clumsy American mistake. When asked for his honest post-war opinion of the P-47, Galland paused, then gave an answer that stunned the American veterans in the room. "We misjudged the Thunderbolt completely. We saw a huge, heavy fighter and laughed. We believed the Americans did not understand air combat, that they built a bomber and called it a fighter. We were wrong. The Americans were fighting a different kind of war. They built an airplane around power, durability, and firepower, and they built them in numbers we could not imagine. I flew a captured P-47 after the war. The power was astonishing. It climbed like the earth was falling away beneath it. The cockpit was comfortable. You could fight for hours without fatigue. The visibility was superb. The controls precise. It was a pilot's aircraft wrapped in armor." Galland looked at the American veterans and concluded, "When I realized the United States built over 15,000 of these complicated machines while fighting a global war, I understood something. Germany never had a chance. The sound of its guns, we called them Roosevelt's piano, still echoes in my mind. Many of my friends heard that sound for the last time. The P-47 didn't merely defeat the Luftwaffe, it dismantled it, piece by piece, sortie by sortie, until nothing remained." The P-47 Thunderbolt embodied American industrial philosophy in its purest form. Overbuild everything, overpower everything, and engineer every system to survive punishment no other fighter could endure. Its internal structure was a masterpiece of brute force engineering. The wing spars alone could withstand 40,000 pounds of stress, more than triple the aircraft's loaded weight. The engine mount was rated for 12 Gs, far more than any pilot could survive. Control cables were duplicated throughout, with automatic backups in case of damage. Even the ammunition system displayed extraordinary complexity. Each wing housed 4 guns, each gun with its own 425-round ammunition box. Electric booster motors kept the belts feeding smoothly during high-G maneuvers. The guns were electrically heated to prevent freezing at altitude. Each had an independent charging mechanism, and all 8 could be synchronized or adjusted to converge at various distances between 150 and 400 yards. After the war, some German pilots insisted that the P-47 had won only because of American quantity, not quality, that German fighters were technically superior but overwhelmed by numbers. The combat data tells a different story. In engagements where numbers were equal, Thunderbolts consistently came out on top. German 20mm cannon shells were devastating when they hit, but the P-47's .50 caliber batteries created a probability cloud of bullets so dense that a short burst virtually guaranteed multiple hits. German cannon carried perhaps 120 to 200 rounds. A P-47 pilot carried 3,400. Gun camera analysis revealed that even a brief 2-second burst from a Thunderbolt typically put 20 or more armor-piercing incendiary rounds into a fighter-sized target, more than enough to destroy it. The ammunition itself was lethal by design. The American .50 caliber API, armor-piercing incendiary, round used a delayed action fuse, allowing it to penetrate before igniting. The incendiary compound burned at over 3,000 degrees, hot enough to melt aluminum. German 20mm shells often detonated on impact, causing dramatic flashes but sometimes insufficient internal damage. The P-47 Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced. At 10,000 pounds empty, it weighed more than some twin-engine aircraft. Its engine produced more horsepower than entire bomber formations had in the previous war. Its guns delivered more firepower than an infantry platoon. Yet the Thunderbolt was built by teenagers and factory workers who had never seen an aircraft before 1941, flown in combat by young men barely old enough to shave, and maintained by mechanics who learned their trade in a matter of weeks. What the Germans once mocked as a lumbering, flying milk jug became, in less than 2 years, the most feared aircraft Luftwaffe personnel had ever encountered. Veterans who had fought Spitfires, Hurricanes and Soviet Yaks without flinching spoke of Thunderbolts with quiet reverence, even decades later. At the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, a fully restored P-47D sits among other legendary fighters. Visitors often pause at a small display case beside it. Inside are spent .50 caliber shell casings and a strip of gun camera film showing a Focke-Wulf 19T disintegrating under concentrated fire. Below the display is a translated quote from a 1945 Luftwaffe interrogation report written by an anonymous German pilot. "We laughed when we first saw them. Fat, ugly American fighters that could not turn, could not climb, could not dogfight. We stopped laughing when we realized they did not need to. They only had to point their guns at you, and you ceased to exist. The laughter died with our comrades." The P-47 Thunderbolt entered the war as an object of ridicule and ended it as an avatar of destruction. Between those 2 points, 8 synchronized Browning machine guns rewrote the rules of aerial warfare and buried the Luftwaffe beneath an avalanche of steel and fire. In April 1943, German pilots laughed at the ungainly American fighter. By May 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh. The thunder had spoken, and the sky, at last, belonged to America.